They called her foolish for buying the crumbling stone mill, but what she discovered inside proved them all wrong. They mocked her, whispered behind her back, and shook their heads in pity, but no one could have imagined that this pile of ancient stones would transform the fate of an entire village and silence every tongue that wagged against her. Subscribe to Mr. Wild's story and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The village of Thornwick had long grown comfortable with its own rhythms, with the predictable turn of seasons, the reliable gossip that flowed through the market square like a river, and the unspoken rules that governed who belonged and who did not. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, where tradition held more weight than ambition, and where change was met not with curiosity but with suspicion. Into this rigid world came a decision that would shake the foundations of everything the village thought it understood about folly and wisdom. Alina Ashford had arrived in Thornwick 3 years prior, a widow in her early 40s with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that carried the weight of loss but had not yet surrendered to despair. She had come seeking quiet, seeking distance from the city that had taken her husband in a factory accident and left her with grief too heavy to carry among the noise and bustle of urban life. The village had accepted her with the cautious politeness reserved for outsiders, watching as she took up residence in a small cottage on the edge of town, kept to herself, and worked odd jobs to make ends meet. She mended clothes, helped with harvests, and sometimes assisted the village herbalist in gathering plants from the surrounding hills. She was unremarkable, forgettable even, and that had suited her perfectly. But on a gray morning in late autumn, when the wind carried the smell of coming snow and the last leaves clung stubbornly to the trees, Alina did something that thrust her into the harsh spotlight of village scrutiny. She purchased the old stone mill that had stood abandoned at the edge of Thornwick for more than 40 years. A towering ruin of moss-covered stones and rotting timbers that loomed over the dried creek bed like a monument to decay. The mill had been built generations ago when the creek still ran swift and strong, when it had ground grain for half the valley and brought prosperity to families whose names were now carved on weathered tombstones in the village cemetery. But time and drought had starved the creek to nothing more than a trickle, and the mill had fallen silent. Its great wheel had stopped turning, its grinding stones had stilled, and one by one the families who depended on it had moved away or turned to other trades. For decades it had stood empty, its roof collapsing inward, its walls cracking under the weight of neglect, its very presence a reminder of better days that would never return. When word spread that Alina Ashford had purchased this ruin from the town council for a pittance, the reaction was immediate and merciless. At the bakery, women clutched their shopping baskets and laughed until tears streamed down their faces. At the tavern, men slapped the bar and declared that the widow had finally lost what little sense she had left. Children ran through the streets chanting cruel rhymes about the foolish woman who bought a pile of rocks. Even the priest, usually measured in his words, shook his head slowly during Sunday service and reminded his congregation that pride and foolishness often walked hand in hand, though he was careful not to mention names. The morning after the sale was finalized, Alina walked through the village to collect supplies, and everywhere she went, the whispers followed like shadows. She felt the weight of their stares, heard the barely suppressed laughter, caught fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when she drew near. At the general store, the clerk handed her purchases across the counter with a pitying smile and asked, in a voice loud enough for others to hear, whether she planned to live among the rats and ghosts that surely inhabited such a cursed place. She thanked him quietly, paid, and left without defending herself. Her sister Margaret, who lived 2 villages over, rode out to see her that very afternoon, her face tight with worry and frustration. She found Alina standing before the mill, hands on her hips, studying the structure with an intensity that made Margaret's stomach turn with dread. "Have you lost your mind completely?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp with the authority of an older sibling. "This place is a death trap. The walls could collapse at any moment. The floor is rotted through. What possessed you to waste what little money you have on this monstrosity?" Alina turned to face her sister, and for the first time in 3 years, Margaret saw something in her eyes that had been absent since the funeral. A spark, A flicker of purpose. "I know what I am doing," Elena said quietly. "Trust me." But Margaret did not trust her, could not understand her, and rode away shaking her head, convinced that grief had finally broken her sister's mind. That evening, she shared her concerns with neighbors, who shared them with others, and by the following morning, the entire valley had concluded that Elena Ashford was not merely foolish but dangerously unhinged. The mockery intensified. Farmers who passed the mill on their way to market would slow their wagons and shout taunts. "Building a castle, are you, my lady?" they called, their laughter coarse and cruel. Boys dared one another to climb the crumbling walls, treating the mill as a playground for their recklessness while Elena worked inside. Women gathered at the well and speculated loudly about what delusions drove a widow to such madness, suggesting that loneliness had poisoned her judgment, that she was chasing fantasies to fill the void left by her husband's death. Even those who might have felt sympathy kept their silence, unwilling to align themselves with someone the village had marked as a fool. To defend Elena was to invite ridicule upon oneself, and in a place like Thornwick, social exile was a punishment few were willing to risk. And so she stood alone, surrounded by crumbling stones and the echoes of laughter that drifted across the empty creek bed. But Elena did not waver. Each morning she rose before dawn, brewed strong tea in her cottage, and walked the narrow path to the mill as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. She came armed not with grand plans or blueprints, but with simple tools: a hammer, a pry bar, a broom, and a determination that had been forged in the crucible of loss. She knew what it was to be broken. She knew what it was to feel like a ruin. And she knew, with a certainty that needed no explanation, that within these stones lay something worth fighting for. The first weeks were devoted to clearing debris. The interior of the mill was a chaos of fallen beams, shattered pottery, rusted tools, and the accumulated filth of 4 decades. Birds had nested in the rafters, mice had burrowed into the corners, and the smell of rot and mildew hung thick in the air. Elena worked methodically, hauling out armloads of wreckage, sweeping away layers of dust and leaves, clearing space to see what remained beneath the decay. Her hands blistered and bled. Her back ached with a persistence that kept her awake at night, but she did not stop. As she worked, she began to see the mill not as it was, but as it had been. She traced her fingers along the massive stones that formed the walls, each one cut and placed with care by hands long turned to dust. She examined the great wooden gears that had once turned in perfect synchrony, their teeth worn smooth by decades of labor. She stood before the grinding stones, each weighing more than a horse, and marveled at the precision with which they had been balanced. This had not been merely a building. It had been a masterpiece of engineering, a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of those who had built it. And though the village saw only ruin, Elena saw the bones of something magnificent. The villagers continued to watch, their mockery evolving from amused laughter to something darker. There was an edge of resentment now, a bitterness that came from watching someone refuse to accept the judgment of the community. When Elena walked through the village for supplies, women turned their backs. When she asked for help hauling a particularly heavy beam, men claimed they had no time to waste on foolishness. Children threw stones at the mill's walls when they thought she was not looking. And someone she never discovered who painted the word "madwoman" across the door in crude red letters. She scrubbed the paint away in silence, her jaw set, her eyes dry. She had cried enough in the years since her husband's death. She had no tears left for the cruelty of strangers. Autumn deepened into winter. Snow fell in heavy curtains, blanketing the village and the mill alike in white silence. The wind howled through the broken roof, and ice formed in glittering sheets along the interior walls. Elena wrapped herself in layers of wool, built small fires in a makeshift hearth, and continued her work. She reinforced the walls where cracks had spread, bracing them with timber she scavenged from the forest. She cleared the debris from the grinding room, revealing the massive circular stones that lay dormant like sleeping giants. She climbed into the loft, stepping carefully over rotted boards, and examined the great gears that hung suspended from the ceiling, their iron teeth still sharp despite the rust. And it was there, on a day when the snow fell so thickly that the world outside disappeared into white nothingness, that Alina made her first discovery. Tucked into a corner of the loft, hidden beneath a pile of moldy sacks, she found a wooden chest. It was small, no larger than a bread box, and its surface was carved with intricate patterns of wheat and water, the symbols of the mill's purpose. Her heart quickened as she knelt beside it, brushing away the dust and cobwebs. The lock had rusted through, and it opened with a groan that echoed through the empty mill. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a series of documents. Maps, ledgers, letters, and beneath them all a set of carefully folded blueprints drawn in fading ink on heavy parchment. Alina spread them across the floor, her breath coming fast, her hands trembling. These were the original plans for the mill, drawn by the master builder who had designed it more than a century ago. They showed every stone, every gear, every channel and sluice. But more than that, they showed something the village had long forgotten. The creek that ran past the mill had not always been its only source of water. Deep beneath the earth, according to these plans, ran an underground spring, a source of water that had been tapped by the mill's original builders to supplement the creek during dry seasons. The spring fed into a hidden cistern beneath the grinding room, from which water could be drawn and channeled to turn the wheel even when the creek ran low. Over the decades, as the creek had dwindled and the mill had fallen into disuse, the knowledge of this spring had been lost, buried beneath time and neglect. Alina sat back on her heels, her mind racing. If the spring still existed, if it still flowed, then the mill could be brought back to life. Not as it had been, dependent on the whims of weather and rainfall, but as something more reliable, more enduring. She thought of the village, of the families who struggled each year as droughts grew longer and harvests grew smaller. She thought of the grain they hauled to distant mills, paying dearly for the service, losing days of labor to travel. And she thought of the laughter, the mockery, the cruel certainty with which they had dismissed her. She folded the blueprints carefully, returned them to the chest, and descended from the loft with a new fire burning in her chest. The discovery was only the beginning. Proving it, bringing it to life, would require more than hope. It would require excavation, engineering, and a stubbornness that matched the stones themselves. Winter deepened its grip on Thornwick. The village hunkered down against the cold, smoke rising from chimneys, families gathered close around fires, the world shrinking to the space between walls. But at the mill, Alina worked with a fevered intensity that bordered on obsession. She studied the blueprints until she could see them with her eyes closed, tracing the path of the underground channels, calculating depths and angles. She borrowed books on engineering from the traveling merchant who passed through once a month, trading her remaining savings for knowledge. And when the snow eased enough to allow it, she began to dig. The grinding room floor was made of thick wooden planks, many of them rotted through. Alina pried them up one by one, revealing the stone foundation beneath. According to the blueprints, the cistern lay 6 feet below this foundation, accessible through a shaft that had been sealed with a stone cap. She cleared away decades of accumulated dirt and debris, sweeping, scraping, hauling bucket after bucket of filth out into the snow. Her hands were raw, her muscles screamed, and more than once she collapsed in exhaustion, waking hours later stiff and cold. But she found it. Beneath the dirt and stone, she uncovered the cap, a massive circular slab of granite engraved with the same symbols of wheat and water that had adorned the chest. It took her 3 days to pry it loose, working with levers and wedges, sweat pouring down her face despite the freezing air. And when it finally shifted, grinding against the stone beneath, a rush of cold air rose from the darkness below, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of flowing water. Alina lowered a lantern into the shaft, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The light reflected off a surface far below, glittering and alive. Water. The spring still flowed, hidden beneath the earth, patient and inexhaustible, waiting for someone to remember it existed. She sat back, tears streaming down her face, not from sadness but from a relief so profound it left her shaking. She had been right. The village had mocked her, dismissed her, called her mad, but she had been right. The mill was not a ruin. It was a sleeping giant, and she had found its heartbeat. But discovering the spring was only half the battle. Bringing it to the surface, channeling it to turn the wheel, restoring the mill to working order, these tasks would require resources she did not have, strength beyond what her body could give, and time that winter was stealing day by day. The village would not help her. They had made that abundantly clear. She was alone in this, as she had been alone in everything since her husband's death. Yet as she sat in the cold darkness of the grinding room, listening to the whisper of water far below, Alina felt something she had not felt in years. Not hope, not exactly, but something close to it, a sense of purpose. A reason to wake each morning, to push through pain, to endure the laughter and the scorn. The mill had become more than a building. It had become a mission, a promise she had made not to the village but to herself. She would see it through no matter the cost. The winter slowly released its grip on Thornwick. Snow melted into mud, streams swelled with runoff, and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. Alina continued her work with a single-minded focus that unnerved those who saw her. She was thinner now, her clothes hanging loose, her face gaunt, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made people look away. At the market, she bartered for rope, for pulleys, for iron chains, trading away her few possessions piece by piece. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice carried a quiet authority that silenced jokes before they could be spoken. But the mockery had not disappeared. It had merely changed form. Now, instead of laughter, there was pity mixed with irritation. The villagers were tired of her obsession, tired of the way she haunted the general store with her strange requests, tired of the way she refused to acknowledge that she had made a terrible mistake. The mill had become an embarrassment to Thornwick, a reminder that one of their own had gone mad and no one had stopped her. Margaret visited again as spring arrived, her face lined with worry. She found Alina in the grinding room, covered in dirt, hauling buckets of stone and mud from the shaft. "Alina, please," Margaret begged, her voice breaking. "You are killing yourself for nothing. Look at you, you are skin and bones. You have spent everything you had. For what? For a building that will never work again." Alina straightened, wiping sweat from her brow, and met her sister's eyes. "It will work," she said simply. "I have found the spring. I have seen the water. It flows beneath us even now, Margaret. All I must do is bring it to the surface." Margaret stared at her, torn between disbelief and a desperate desire to believe. "And if you do, what then? The village will never accept it. They have decided you are a fool, and nothing you do will change their minds." Alina smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "I am not doing this for them. I am doing it because it is right, because something broken can be mended, because I refuse to let the laughter win." Margaret left without another word, and Alina returned to her labor. She knew her sister meant well, knew that the concern was genuine, but she also knew that Margaret would never understand. How could she? She had not felt the call of the stones, had not heard the whisper of water beneath the earth, had not carried the weight of being dismissed and mocked by an entire community. This was Alina's fight, and she would see it through alone. Spring turned to summer. The sun blazed down on Thornwick, baking the earth until it cracked, reminding everyone of the drought that was never far away. And at the mill, Alina achieved what the village had thought impossible. She cleared the shaft completely, exposing the ancient channels that connected the spring to the cistern. She repaired the stone conduits, sealing cracks with mortar she mixed herself from clay and lime. She rebuilt the sluice gates, fashioning new wooden panels from timber she felled in the forest and hauled back on her own shoulders. She oiled the gears, replaced broken teeth with pieces she forged in a makeshift furnace, and slowly, painfully, brought the mechanism of the mill back to working order. It took her 6 months. 6 months of labor so intense that she often worked through the night, sleeping in brief snatches on the floor of the grinding room, waking with the sun already high and her body screaming in protest. 6 months of isolation, of eating sparingly, of ignoring the whispers and the stares. 6 months of doubt that crept in during the darkest hours, whispering that she was indeed a fool, that she would fail, that the village had been right all along. But doubt is only as strong as the will that opposes it, and Alina's will had been tempered by grief into something unbreakable. And then came the day when everything changed. It was a morning in late summer, the air thick with heat, the sky a dome of cloudless blue. Alina stood in the grinding room, her hands resting on the lever that controlled the sluice gates. She had tested every part of the system, checked every connection, traced every channel. The spring flowed strong beneath her feet, its water cold and pure. The gears were aligned. The grinding stones were balanced. The great wheel outside, which she had spent 2 weeks repairing and reinforcing, hung ready. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to no god in particular, and pulled the lever. The sound started as a whisper, a distant rumble deep in the earth. Then it grew, water rushing through channels that had been dry for 40 years, surging upward through the cistern, flooding into the sluice that led to the wheel. Elena ran outside, her heart in her throat, and watched as water, clear and cold, poured from the sluice and struck the wheel's paddles. For a moment, nothing happened. The wheel groaned, resisting, its joints stiff from decades of stillness. But the water kept coming, relentless and strong, and slowly, with a shriek of protesting wood and metal, the wheel began to turn. It was slow at first, each rotation an agony of effort. But as the water found its rhythm, as the gears inside caught and began to pull, the wheel's movement smoothed, quickened, became steady. The sound of it was like thunder, a deep, thrumming roar that echoed across the valley. Inside the mill, the grinding stones began to move, one turning slowly against the other, their surfaces grinding together after 40 years of silence. Elena stood in the sunlight, water splashing her face, and let out a cry of triumph that rose above the roar of the wheel. She had done it. The mill lived. The sound carried across the village like a shockwave. Farmers in their fields straightened from their work, shading their eyes against the sun, trying to identify the source of the distant thunder. Women hanging laundry paused, baskets balanced on their hips, turning their heads toward the edge of town where the old mill stood. Children playing in the square fell silent, their games forgotten as the unfamiliar sound rolled over them like a wave. And in the tavern, where men had gathered to escape the midday heat, conversations died mid-sentence as they recognized what they were hearing. The mill was running. At first, no one believed it. It had to be something else, they told themselves. Perhaps a summer storm approaching or a rock slide in the distant hills. But as the sound continued, steady and rhythmic, doubt crept into their certainty. One by one, people began moving toward the mill, their pace quickening as curiosity overcame skepticism. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, a crowd had gathered on the dirt road that led to the structure, standing at a cautious distance, staring in disbelief at the sight before them. The great wheel turned with a steady, powerful rhythm, water cascading from its paddles in glittering sheets. The mill itself, which had been a ruin just months before, now stood transformed. The roof had been patched, the walls reinforced, the windows cleared of debris. Smoke rose from a small chimney Elena had installed, and through the open door they could see the grinding stones rotating, could hear the deep grinding song of stone against stone. It was impossible, and yet it was happening before their eyes. Elena emerged from the mill, her clothes soaked with water and sweat, her face flushed with exertion and triumph. She saw the crowd and stopped, her chest heaving, her hands trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. For a long moment no one spoke. The villagers stared at her as though she were a ghost or a witch or something equally inexplicable. The mockery that had lived so easily on their tongues now died in their throats, replaced by a stunned silence that was somehow louder than any insult. It was old Jacob, the village blacksmith, who finally found his voice. He was a man of few words, respected for his honesty and his skill, and when he spoke, others listened. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes moving from Elena to the turning wheel and back again. "How?" he asked simply, his voice rough with wonder. Elena met his gaze, and in her eyes was no triumph, no gloating, only exhaustion and a quiet satisfaction. "There is a spring beneath the mill," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of rushing water. "It has been there all along, feeding the cistern that the original builders installed. The village forgot about it when the mill was abandoned, but the water never stopped flowing. I found the plans, I cleared the channels, and I brought it back to life." The crowd murmured, a rustling sound like wind through dry leaves. Some faces showed wonder, others disbelief, and more than a few showed shame as they remembered the cruelty they had shown this woman who now stood before them vindicated. Margaret pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face, and embraced her sister without words, holding her as though afraid she might disappear. But not everyone was moved to joy. Cornelius Wade, the wealthiest landowner in Thornwick and a man whose opinion carried weight in village affairs, stepped forward with his face set in hard lines. He was not a man who enjoyed being proven wrong, and the sight of the mill working stirred something bitter in him. "This changes nothing," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "So you have gotten the wheel to turn. What good is it? Who will bring their grain to a mill run by a woman who knows nothing of the trade? Who will trust the quality of flour ground by someone with no training, no apprenticeship, no right to call herself a miller?" His words hung in the air, and Alina felt their weight. He was not entirely wrong. She had restored the mill's machinery, but she had never operated it for its intended purpose. She knew how to make the wheel turn, how to channel the water, but grinding grain into flour required skill and knowledge she did not possess. The grinding stones had to be dressed regularly, kept sharp and properly balanced. The flow of grain had to be controlled precisely to avoid waste or poor quality. It was a craft that took years to master, and she had none of that experience. But before she could respond, another voice spoke up. It was Thomas, a young man in his 20s whose family had once run a mill 3 valleys over before drought had forced them to sell. He had worked alongside his father since childhood, learning the trade, but when the mill closed, he had been forced to take work as a common laborer, his skills worthless in a village that had no use for a miller. He stepped forward now, his hat clutched in his hands, his expression uncertain but hopeful. "I could teach her," he said quietly, then louder as others turned to look at him. "I know the trade. My father taught me everything before he died. I have been wasting away doing odd jobs because there was no mill to work in, but if Mistress Ashford would have me, I could teach her what she needs to know. We could run it together." Alina looked at the young man, saw the desperation and hope mingled in his face, and felt something shift inside her. She had been so focused on restoring the mill, on proving the village wrong, that she had not thought beyond that moment of triumph. But Thomas was right. The mill was alive, but it needed skilled hands to make it truly useful. And here was someone offering not mockery or doubt, but partnership. "I would be honored," she said, and the smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunrise. Cornelius Wade scowled, but he said nothing more. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their homes and their work, but the conversations that followed were different now. The laughter had stopped. The mockery had died. In its place was something new, a cautious curiosity, a reassessment of the woman they had dismissed so easily. Some felt shame for how they had treated her. Others felt resentment that she had been proven right, but none could deny what they had seen. Over the following weeks, word spread beyond Thornwick. Neighboring villages heard of the mill that had been brought back from ruin, of the spring that flowed beneath it, of the widow who had accomplished what everyone said was impossible. Farmers began arriving with wagons loaded with grain, curious to see if the stories were true, willing to risk their harvest to test the quality of the mill's work. Alina and Thomas worked side by side, the young man teaching her the subtle art of adjusting the stones, controlling the flow, judging the fineness of the flour by touch and sight. She learned quickly, her hands finding the rhythm, her instincts sharpening with practice. The flour they produced was good, better than good. The grinding stones, perfectly balanced and carefully maintained, produced a fine, even texture that bakers praised. The bread made from their flour rose higher, tasted richer, and stayed fresh longer. Word spread quickly, and soon the mill was operating from dawn until dusk, the great wheel turning endlessly, the grinding stones singing their ancient song. But the true test came in the autumn, when the drought that had threatened Thornwick for years finally arrived in full force. The summer had been hot and dry, and as autumn approached, the streams and wells that the village depended on began to fail. The creek that ran past the mill, already reduced to a trickle, dried up completely. Farmers watched their wells drop lower each day, rationing water for their families and livestock, facing the grim possibility of having to abandon their land. And yet the mill continued to run. While every other water source in the valley failed, the spring beneath the mill flowed as strong as ever, untouched by the drought that gripped the surface world. Alina's discovery had given the village more than a functioning mill. It had given them a lifeline. It was Margaret who first suggested what came next. She arrived at the mill one evening as Alina was closing up for the night, her face drawn with worry. "The village well is nearly dry," she said without preamble. "Families are walking 3 miles to the river just to fill their buckets, and even that is running low. People are getting sick from bad water. Alina, you have to help them." Alina looked at her sister, then at the mill, at the water that poured endlessly from the spring to turn the wheel. She thought of the laughter, the mockery, the cruelty. She thought of Cornelius Wade's dismissive words, of the children who had thrown stones, of the neighbors who had turned their backs when she needed help. Part of her, a small, bitter part, wanted to refuse. Wanted to let them suffer as she had suffered, to let them learn what it meant to be dismissed and abandoned. But that part was small, and it was drowned by something larger. She remembered her husband, remembered the kindness he had shown to everyone, even those who did not deserve it. She remembered why she had come to Thornwick in the first place, seeking not revenge or validation, but peace. And she knew that peace could not be found in cruelty, even cruelty that felt justified. "We will share the water," she said simply. The next morning, Alina and Thomas modified the sluice system, creating a secondary channel that diverted a portion of the spring's flow into a stone trough they built beside the mill. The water ran clear and cold, more than enough to supply the village's needs without diminishing the power that turned the wheel. Alina sent word through Margaret that anyone who needed water could come and take it freely. At first they came in ones and twos, shamefaced and hesitant, unwilling to meet Alina's eyes as they filled their buckets. But as the drought deepened and desperation grew, the trickle became a flood. By the end of the first week, there was a constant line of people waiting to draw water from the mill, families bringing barrels and jugs, farmers bringing their livestock to drink from the overflow that pooled in a basin Alina had constructed. The spring, hidden beneath the earth for 40 years, now sustained the entire village. Alina asked for nothing in return. No payment, no apologies, no acknowledgement of how wrong they had been. She simply stood by and watched as the people who had mocked her came day after day to drink from the spring she had found, to grind their grain at the mill she had restored, to benefit from the discovery they had called foolishness. But gratitude, like water, finds its own level. Slowly, in small ways, the village began to change. Cornelius Wade, humbled by his own thirst, came to the mill with his hat in his hands and offered Alina a formal apology. Others followed, some with words, some with gifts, firewood, vegetables, offers to help with repairs. The children who had thrown stones now ran errands for her without being asked. The women who had whispered cruel gossip now greeted her with genuine warmth when she came to market. Thomas became not just her apprentice but her partner in truth, helping her expand the mill's operations, experimenting with different grinding techniques, even beginning to take orders from villages farther afield. The mill's reputation spread across the valley, and with it, Alina's story. The widow who had been called foolish became known as the woman who saved Thornwick, who had seen possibility where others saw only ruin, who had endured mockery with dignity and answered cruelty with generosity. One evening, as the autumn sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Alina stood outside the mill and watched the great wheel turn. The sound of it had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, a constant rhythm that marked the passage of days. She thought of the chest she had found in the loft, of the blueprints that had revealed the spring's existence, of the months of back-breaking labor that had followed. She thought of the laughter that had cut her, the isolation that had nearly broken her, the moments when she had questioned her own sanity. And she thought of her husband, of the lessons he had taught her about perseverance and kindness, about seeing value where others saw none. He had died working with machines, giving his life to the industrial progress that had promised so much and delivered so much pain. But here in this ancient mill, Alina had found a different kind of progress. Not the grinding march of factories and smoke, but something older, more patient, more enduring. The harnessing of natural forces, the application of human skill and determination, the creation of something that served not profit but community. The mill had saved the village, but in truth, the village had saved her as well. It had given her purpose when grief had left her hollow, had given her strength when mockery had tried to break her, had given her proof that even the most broken things could be mended if someone cared enough to try. Margaret came to visit often now, no longer with worry but with pride. She would sit with Alina in the grinding room, watching the stones turn, marveling at what her sister had accomplished. "I should have believed in you," she said one evening, her voice thick with regret. "I should have helped instead of doubting." Alina took her sister's hand and squeezed it gently. "You were trying to protect me, I understand that now. And perhaps I needed the doubt, perhaps it made me more determined to succeed." As winter approached once more, the village prepared for the cold months with a confidence they had not felt in years. Their wells had been replenished by the autumn rains, but everyone knew that if drought returned, the mill's spring would sustain them. The mill itself operated at full capacity, grinding grain not just for Thornwick, but for half a dozen surrounding villages. Thomas had taken on 2 apprentices, young men eager to learn the trade, and plans were already being discussed to expand the building, to add storage facilities and perhaps even a small bakery. But for Alina, the greatest reward was not the mill's success or the village's gratitude. It was the simple, profound satisfaction of having trusted her instincts when everyone else said she was wrong. Of having looked at a pile of crumbling stones and seen not what it was, but what it could become. Of having endured mockery without becoming bitter, and having achieved vindication without becoming proud. The mill stood now not just as a building, but as a testament. A testament to the value of perseverance, to the wisdom of looking beyond surface appearances, to the possibility of redemption and renewal. The village that had once laughed at Alina Ashford now depended on her, respected her, and in many cases loved her. But more importantly, she had proven something to herself, that she was stronger than her grief, braver than her fears, and capable of achievements that seemed impossible even to her own eyes. On the first anniversary of the day she had purchased the mill, the village held a celebration in her honor. They gathered in the square, bringing food and drink, music and laughter. The priest gave a speech praising her vision and determination. Cornelius Wade, in a gesture that surprised everyone, announced that he was donating land adjacent to the mill for expansion. Children performed a play they had written themselves, telling the story of the foolish woman who bought the broken mill and became a hero. Alina stood before them, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection, and struggled to find words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the assembled crowd. "I did not restore the mill to prove anyone wrong," she said. "I did it because I needed to believe that broken things could be fixed, that abandoned things could be valuable, that something discarded and forgotten could still serve a purpose. I was broken when I came here. I was abandoned by circumstances, forgotten by the world that once knew me, and in restoring this mill, I restored myself." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the faces before her, seeing in them the same people who had mocked her, but also seeing how they had changed, how they had grown. "You called me foolish," she continued, "and perhaps I was, but foolishness and wisdom are often separated by nothing more than the passage of time and the proof of results. What looks like madness at the beginning may look like genius at the end. The only way to know the difference is to have the courage to try." The crowd erupted in applause, and Alina felt tears sting her eyes, but she smiled through them. This moment, this validation was sweeter because she had earned it through her own effort, through months of doubt and pain and solitary labor. No one had given her this triumph. She had carved it from stone and stubbornness, had wrung it from earth and water, had built it with her own bleeding hands. As the celebration continued around her, Alina slipped away quietly, walking the familiar path back to the mill. The wheel turned steadily in the moonlight, water cascading from its paddles, the sound of it a song that had become the soundtrack of her new life. She climbed the steps to the grinding room and stood among the machinery she knew so intimately now, running her hands over the stones, feeling their warmth, their solidity. This place had become more than a business, more than a building. It had become home. Not the cottage where she slept, but this space of stone and wood and flowing water. This place where she had poured out her grief and found purpose, where she had been mocked and then vindicated, where she had discovered that the greatest discoveries often lie not in distant lands or grand adventures, but in the courage to dig beneath the surface of what everyone else has dismissed. The spring still flowed beneath her feet, as it had flowed for centuries, as it would flow for centuries more. Patient, inexhaustible, waiting for someone to remember it existed. Alina had been that someone, and in finding the spring, she had found herself. Years would pass. The mill would continue to prosper, becoming a cornerstone of the valley's economy. Thomas would eventually marry, and his children would grow up learning the trade, ensuring that the knowledge would pass to another generation. Alina would grow old within these walls, her hair turning fully silver, her hands gnarled with age, but her eyes would never lose that spark of determination that had carried her through the darkest days. And long after she was gone, long after her name had faded from living memory, the mill would stand as a monument. Not to foolishness vindicated, but to something more profound, to the truth that wisdom often wears the mask of folly, that treasures often hide in ruins, and that the greatest achievements belong to those who refuse to accept the world's dismissal, who dig deeper when others walk away, who see possibility where others see only decay. The village would tell the story to their children, and their children would tell it to theirs. The tale of the widow who bought the crumbling mill, who endured mockery with dignity, who found the hidden spring, who saved them all. Some details would change with each telling, as stories do, but the heart of it would remain true. That Alina Ashford had looked at something the world called worthless and seen its value, had been called a fool and proven herself wise, had been broken and made herself whole. And every time the great wheel turned, every time water poured from the spring into the channels she had cleared, every time grain was ground into flour that would become bread, the mill itself would whisper her story to anyone patient enough to listen. A story not of magic or luck, but of simple, stubborn determination. Of a woman who refused to let the laughter win, who trusted her instincts over popular opinion, who knew that the only true failure is the failure to try. The stones would grind on, year after year, turning doubt into certainty, mockery into respect, ruin into purpose. And in that endless rotation, in that patient transformation of grain into flour, of water into power, of abandonment into redemption, the mill would continue to teach the lesson Alina had learned and lived. That sometimes the wisest thing you can do is what everyone else calls foolish. That sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. That sometimes the only way to prove the world wrong is to quietly, stubbornly, relentlessly prove yourself right. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the crumbling stones that everyone walks past without a second glance contain within them everything you need to build a life worth living. If you were amazed by Alina's story, do not stop here. Hit subscribe to Mr. Wild Story right now so you never miss the next incredible tale of courage and transformation. Tap the bell so you are always first to discover what happens next. Check out the other remarkable stories waiting for you on this channel, each one more inspiring than the last. And do not keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family, so they too can witness what happens when determination meets possibility.